We've been walking through forgiveness, and this will be our last message on forgiveness before we move on to Advent. And Casey, let's throw it up. Thank you. There's a poem called Two Mothers, and it reads in part, "The city slept, and in the burial place slept still more soundly its inhabitants. Indifferent to the early morning calls the birds were sending out, there in the gloom that lingers from the night to the tint of day, two women met. Both paused, for each well knew some great emotion brought the other one forth, just like herself at this hour of the dawn. They were not young, but care and grief had added more lines than time to each sad, stricken face. They spoke, though strangers, and as both were tired and felt the need of company, perhaps, seated themselves together on a rock and gazed into the east's approaching light. 'I could not sleep,' the first one softly said. 'This is the day of which he used to speak, saying he would return. My son, I mean. They crucified him yonder on that hill 2 nights ago. I never knew his crime, and even Pilate wished to let him go, but at last bowed to the priest's demands.' 'Your son was Jesus?' said the other just then, and caught her breath as if in sudden fear. 'My son was Jesus,' said the first. 'Folks often wondered why I named him that, but I could not explain it to everyone, nor could I understand all that he did. And things he would say would often puzzle me. Even when he was small, these past few years, I have not understood why he must do the things that caused his death, as he had known they would and often spoke of to me. Have you a son?' The other's startled face paled as she said, 'I had one, but he too died 3 days ago. Only he hanged himself.' 'Ah,' said the first, 'but did his enemies stone him and spit upon him and call him vile names?' 'No,' was the answer. 'Even the friend he wronged forgave him.' 'Tell me,' said Mary, clutching at the hand that grasped the woman's shawl, 'who was your son?' The other bowed her head and slowly spoke. 'His name was Judas. Judas Iscariot.' We've been looking at the weight of forgiveness. And we're on our final Sunday of that. We began with hard stories that spoke to the weight of forgiving, the weight of not only trying to give, but the weight we can feel when we want to experience it. We want to receive forgiveness for the things that we've done wrong. And then last Sunday, we scratched the surface of Christian forgiveness. I defined Christian forgiveness as the radical, costly, and transformative renunciation of the cycle of retribution. It can seem impossible. Considered through history, we have seen, though, at times, a prophet or a prophetess who comes and can show us it can be done. Forgiveness can come out of impossible circumstances. They break the illusion of impossibility. I offered Martin Luther King Jr., Pastor King, as perhaps the best example our nation has ever had of love offering forgiveness. And he died a prophet's death. We read his speech that said, do what you will to us and we will love. You can bomb us, kill us, beat us, jail us. And as hard as it is, we will not stop loving. And he declared the twofold victory that would come from love. He said, we will gain our freedom. But also, if we stick to agape love, we will free you too. We will free you from everything that's been put into you that's causing you to treat us like this. Today, to clarify what forgiveness is, we're going to look at what forgiveness is not and some of what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Reconciliation takes two parties. It takes the perpetrator and the offended or the victim. This is not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a unilateral action, meaning it is done by one person. One person enacts forgiveness. And what forgiveness becomes in its unilateral activity becomes my control over me, not my control over anyone else. Forgiveness is not justice. It's not the balancing of a scale. We in the West picture the scale of justice and it needs to be rebalanced. That's not what forgiveness does. Last week, Jesus even told Peter, as unjust as Lamech's revenge was going to be, that is how unjust our forgiveness will be. Lamech said, my vengeance will know no bounds. There is no thought of justice in how I will do vengeance. My vengeance will be 77 times. In the Hebrew terminology, it meant unlimited. And Jesus says, our forgiveness, Peter, is to be 77 times. It's to be unlimited. There is no bounds. There is no limit to our forgiveness. So we're to forgive unlimited, and it's a Christian. A Christian is a copy of Jesus. So we do what Jesus does. Our forgiveness is what Jesus does. And Jesus says he can only do what the Father does. So if Jesus is telling us, you forgive unlimited, he's saying, that's what I do. You do what I do. And Jesus says, I've come to earth to only do what the Father does. I can do nothing else. So our unjust forgiveness is Christ's forgiveness. I've experienced it in my life. And knowing Christ's forgiveness, I now know how the Father forgives. And we can say, that's not fair. That's not fair. That kind of forgiveness is not fair. If we're hung up on fairness, we're never going to understand Christianity. Because as we're going through Matthew in a little bit, we're going to reach the parable about an unfair vineyard owner. He gives everyone the reward, the full reward for work, even those who didn't fully work. Christianity is unfair as we look at it. Forgiveness is not primarily emotional. Corrie ten Boom, she was a Polish woman who took in Jews and she hid them, and she was Jesus to them. Eventually she was ratted out. She was sent to a concentration camp. Horrible place. Her sister ends up dying. And ultimately, she faces the choice to forgive or not. She's giving a presentation on her experience, and during that time, one of her Nazi jailers is present. And he comes to her and he says, will you forgive me? And she had to work through some hard things. But she came to is that forgiveness is an act of the will. And the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. The will can say things that we don't yet feel. So forgiveness doesn't require friendship, though. It doesn't require trust. It doesn't require a lowering of safety barriers. It doesn't require any of that. But it also doesn't require our emotion. It requires our will. Our desire to want to be free, our desire for all kinds of things about what forgiveness is. And what forgiveness is, we can start with, it's the power to rewrite the story. It can change the narrative. There is a narrative as old as time. And that narrative is retribution. That narrative is we hit back. With forgiveness, this narrative gets rewritten into a journey into freedom. It's a journey into freedom from the spiral of destruction. Rewriting the narrative with forgiveness flips the story of intended evil into intentional good. It reframes the characters. A perpetrator is no longer defined by a single action, no matter how bad. A victim is no longer powerless, including being responsible to respond in a certain way. You have to take an eye for an eye. This is what you have to do as the victim. You're not free to anything else. Forgiveness offers freedom. Forgiveness reclaims agency. One theologian said, when you choose to forgive, you go from victim to saint in your own story. The victim is subject to their circumstances. And the circumstances, people will say, they demand payback. And in demanding payback, they anchor you to your past. But the saint says, I was a victim, and I will still bear these scars going forward. But I will go forward. I will not be anchored to this. You think in the American history lore of the Hatfields and the McCoys, they could not get past the feud. Cycles and cycles of violence. Forgiveness says we can escape the spiral. Forgiveness is the only way we have a future. For nearly 50 years, into the 1990s, South Africa lived under apartheid. Horrible time for South Africa. When it finally ended, when apartheid was over in 1994, everybody around the world held their collective breath for the backlash. 10% of the population was white, and they had held 90% of the population under their fist, their iron fist. And now the 90% was able to rise up. How can the 10% hold back the 90? And the world waited for the 90% to exercise their strength and to hit back. But it wasn't to be. There was a man in South Africa. He was a dreamer. Much like Joseph in Genesis, they both dreamt of what could be in the future. And much like Joseph, this dreamer in South Africa landed in prison. While in prison, Nelson Mandela got to sit and think. He got to sit and think on the cycles of violence. He had started out as a peaceful man who wanted to overcome evil with peace. And then before he went to jail, he slipped into the thoughts, maybe violence is the way. And he began to move into acts of violence. But once he went to jail and he thought about things, he said no. He realized that violence only means more violence. Those prison times greatly shaped both Joseph and Nelson Mandela. And upon getting out, their lives took a similar turn. Joseph gets out of prison. He goes and he's appointed the top man in Egypt. Only God was higher than Joseph. To Egypt, the god was Pharaoh, but only God was higher than Joseph. He was the top man in Egypt. Nelson Mandela gets out of prison, and he is the first post-apartheid president of South Africa. The Bible story is repeating itself in South Africa. And as we look at the story in Genesis, as we look at recent history in the 1990s, both Joseph and Nelson Mandela chose forgiveness. To oversee the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that Nelson Mandela put together to bring peace rather than revenge, he brought in Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The plan was to seek reconciliation, needed forgiveness that would stop the cycle of violence. But Tutu and Mandela, they knew that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is not sweeping things under the rug, out of sight. So instead, they offered amnesty to those who would come forward and confess their crimes. Full amnesty if you will bring the darkness of evil into the light of love. Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he said, there is no future without forgiveness. And he famously wrote, we contend that there is another kind of justice. It is restorative justice. Here, the central concern is not retribution or punishment, but healing. The healing of breaches, the redresses of imbalances, the restoration of broken relationships. This kind of justice seeks to rehabilitate both the victim and the perpetrator, who should be given the opportunity to be reintegrated into the community they have injured by their offense. He went on to say in one of his speeches, there are different kinds of justice. Retributive justice is largely Western. In the South African experience, it was decided that we would have justice. Yes, but not retributive justice. No, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee process was an example of restorative justice. A criminal offense has caused a breach in relationship. And the purpose of the penal process is to heal the breach, to restore good relationships, redress the imbalance. Thus it is that we set out to work for reconciliation between victim and perpetrator. In this speech, he told the story of Amy Beale. Amy Beale was a white American woman in her 20s, I believe, late 20s, I believe, and she went to Africa and she was anti-apartheid. She was part of the pushback against apartheid that was the dominion of the whites. She was stoned to death by black men seeking vengeance. They didn't know she was on their side. Desmond Tutu said her parents spoke up in favor of granting amnesty. Not only did they do that, but they set up the Amy Beale Foundation to try to salvage as many black youths from the violence and the dead-end township ghetto life. Their daughter's murderers now work for the foundation, which is doing outstanding development work in the townships where their daughter was murdered. They are giving new beginnings to many. One of the most moving scenes was Linda, Amy's mother, meeting with the mother of one of her daughter's murderers. And the two mothers, they sat and united. They united in the awful, tragic embrace of forgiveness. One white, the other black, one South African, the other American, bound by a bond of humanity. And the mothers, in embracing with tears streaming down their face, spoke of the possibility of forgiveness and reconnection, the possibility of new beginnings, of healing and restoration to life, out of death. To not forgive is to be bound to the past, as my actions going forward are dictated by the wounds I've received in the past. To forgive is to say, I don't have to wrap my future trajectory around backwards to deal with you and what you did to me in the past. My future is free from the gravitational force of us going around and around and around the wrongs that are committed. It doesn't deny that there was hurt. It doesn't deny that the hurt will have a big impact on me. It doesn't deny that as I came into the gravitational force of another and I was hurt, it threw off my trajectory a little bit. But forgiveness is the choice. Do I get pulled into the gravitational field of that? Or do I move forward? Forgiveness says, I don't have to give up my future to circle back around to you. Forgiveness trusts that the God who is love is always working for good. God is love. God is life. God is existence itself. And that's what he always works for. And so it trusts that God's patient, slow work that will bring good out of bad. And so forgiveness says that if I will just move into the future and not get hung up here, if I will move into the future, the goodness of God will reveal itself. And he will bring good out of this. Just like Joseph, just like Nelson Mandela. There's Saint John Paul the Great. Many of us know him as Pope John Paul II. He wrote extensively about love. He was born Karl Wojtyła. I believe I'm saying that correctly. It's a Polish name. He was born as Karl. And as a university student, he began to live in the Polish land occupied by Germans. He was a university student who then found work at a local quarry. He would go to work walking in wooden shoes for 2 miles. The temperature would be negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. To prevent frostbite, he would coat his face, his exposed skin, with Vaseline as he would go and work in the quarry. He was shaped by hardship. He took his name then after his predecessor, Pope John Paul I, who only survived 1 month as Pope. In his 3rd year as Pope, Mehmet Ali Agha, he wanted to start a holy war. He needs revenge to make this happen. He would go and shoot the Pope. And he needed revenge to make this happen. He shoots the Pope twice. The Pope nearly dies in the hospital. He spent a month in the hospital. Mehmet doesn't get his revenge. Mehmet doesn't get a church that hits back, a pope who says, this is the evil in the world that must be eradicated so the world can be righteous. Instead, Mehmet gets a statement. The first statement Pope John Paul II makes in public after the shooting. The Pope says, I ask you to join me in praying for my brother, Ali Aja, whom I have sincerely forgiven. A bit later, the Pope would go to the prison where Ali Aja had been sentenced to life. He would now forgive the person in person. He would go and he would speak in private to Ali Aja, and he would love on him, forgive him. He would tell him that it's all been forgiven. It doesn't mean it's forgotten. It doesn't mean that it isn't significant. The weight of forgiveness is that something is significant. But its gravity will not change my future. 2,000 years ago, God came to forgive in person. I've said in the past, and I'll say it again, I can think of no other God that I would hope is like the God of Christianity. I can think of no other God that I want to be real than the one who's willing to join us. In our jail cell, wherever we're held captive in our minds, in our lives. The best leaders are the ones who are willing to get down and do the job with everyone else. The best leaders who are willing to say, I want to ask you to do something that I don't do. And so if I'm going to ask you to forgive 77 times, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to forgive 77 times. Call me a little biased, but I want Jesus to be the God of the universe. I want a God who's like that. And nearly 200 years before Jesus started his ministry, though, there was another Messiah. There was another Savior. In 167 BC, there was another Matthew. This Matthew was a priest who lived under the Seleucid Empire. When he died, he commanded his sons to continue to slay the sinners. He said, you who are righteous, pay back the Gentiles in full. Avenge me. One son, Judah, he picked up the message of his father. He picked up those words, and he was a George Washington leading a war for independence. Early in the role, Judah became known as Judah Maccabee, or Judah the Hammer. Maccabee means hammer, and so was Judah the Hammer. He was bringing down the hammer of vengeance on their persecutors. He's a national hero to the Hebrew people to this day. About 100 years before Jesus starts his ministry now, the Roman occupation of the Hebrew people has begun. Over those 100 years, the people grow hungry again for a Messiah, a Savior from those who are oppressing them. They want another Judah the Hammer. The whispers on the streets for 100 years, you can imagine they grow and they grow. Whispers of civil unrest. Whispers that will get you killed. When is the Messiah coming to kill these Romans? Along comes Jesus. And the people grow excited. Could this be the Messiah? Could this be the Savior? Could this be Judah the Hammer? Yes, Jesus says, I'm the Messiah, and I'll give you all the signs. Except one that they were looking for. Jesus starts to preach the love of enemies. He starts to preach the love of enemies, and at his hometown, he reads from Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 2. He reads, and this came out kind of small. It was supposed to be multiple slides. He reads, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And here's where everybody's waiting. The people are so ready for the next part because they know this verse in their head. They are waiting for the new Judah the Hammer to declare, "And it will be the year of vengeance. The vengeance of our God upon the sinners, upon these Gentiles. And in that vengeance, we will find comfort for those who mourn." But Jesus stops. He stops when he says this is the year of the Lord's favor. We have in the flesh of Jesus the God who we considered last week sees no enemies. It is the year of the Lord's favor for all. And the people get so angry that they seek to throw Jesus off of a cliff. The people want a Messiah who will lead them to risk their lives to hit back. And they're offended by a Messiah who says, "Will you risk your life to end the vengeance? Rather than risk your life in vengeance, will you risk your life to end the cycle? So that our kids and their kids, they might be able to hope for something more. Something more than the same old cycle of retribution that's been going on since the beginning of humanity. Will you at least risk your life so that our kids and their kids can know the ultimate freedom? That we aren't enslaved to the actions of others. How someone treats me doesn't dictate how I have to treat them back." We're going to come to our closing thoughts, and you're going to hear the kids and Nate come back here in a second. One theologian says, Jesus comes to show that if sin is the problem, God's fix is to forgive it. And just as the people in Jesus' day couldn't wrap their minds around it, we're here 2,000 years later still not convinced. We're still not able to wrap our minds around it. We still hold on to the paradigm that if the problem is sin, it needs to be punished. It needs to be bombed, killed, fought against. The response to sin is violence. The sinner needs to pay. While Jesus' fix is to simply offer forgiveness. A man comes to a roof. Jesus declares, "Your sins are forgiven." And the religious establishment says, that's not the way this works. You don't get to just forgive. The man has to make payment to God through a sacrifice. The man cannot get off that easily. Jesus says, so that you know this is how it does work, so that you know this is how forgiveness is freely given. Get up and walk, bro. And the man gets up and walks. And even more, so that all of humanity will know that this is how it works. God in Jesus climbs onto the cross. And to his killers, he speaks words of forgiveness. Knowing that we're so freely forgiven, we now carry that into the world. We get to break the cycles of retribution, of vengeance, of violence. We get to be the freely forgivers. We get to freely forgive others. Steve Taylor, based upon the story of the Pope, forgiving his would-be assassin. Steve Taylor wrote a song, "To Forgive," and these are the lyrics of that song. I saw a man. He was holding the hand that had fired a gun at his heart. Oh, will we live to forgive? I saw the eyes, Mehmet's eyes, and the look of surprise that he left an indelible mark. Oh, will we live to forgive? Come, find release, go make your peace. Follow his lead. Let the madness recede when we shatter the cycle of pain. Oh, will we live to forgive? Come find peace. Come find release. Come make your peace. I saw another man. I saw a man with a hole in his hand who could offer the miracle cure. Oh, he said, live. I forgive. Oh, he said, live to forgive. Oh, he said, live to forgive. Nate's going to come up and close us with our last song. This is the God who says, I will forgive 77 times. There is no limit to my forgiveness. My forgiveness breaks the cycle of vengeance. It breaks the cycle of violence. We've had the chance over the last few weeks to look at the prophets, the prophetesses, who every once in a while shine through history to show us it's not impossible. It can feel like it, but they break the illusion of impossibility. God himself came to earth to show it's how he lives. And we in his image, we can live the same way. What an amazing God we have who loves us with unlimited forgiveness. It's that God we get to turn to as we close and worship today. It's the God of forgiveness we get to close this Christian year out with. As we look at him and we think of all he's done to forgive us.